People see things differently all the time. For example, 3 people, a minister, an archaeologist, and a cowboy, were getting their first look at the Grand Canyon one day. The minister exclaimed, "Truly, this is one of the glories of God." The archaeologist commented, "What a wonder of nature this is." And the cowboy said, "Can you imagine trying to find a lost steer in there?" People see things differently in part because of their life's experiences and the lens that creates as they look at the same thing. At other times, it's because the brain can be fooled in part by what it must interpret. For example, do you see a lady with a long feathered hat or an old lady with her head in a cowl? Seeing things differently is not restricted to an individualistic thing. It can be a community-based one too. For example, the messianic hope of those in the Jewish community who held such a belief was that the chosen one would re-establish Israel's supremacy amongst the world's great nations, that the Messiah would make Israel great again in the eyes of the world. The assumption was that this would be accomplished in a violent and vengeful manner with the forceful overthrow and the total destruction of the current ruling powers. But before this happened, the prophet Elijah would return to herald the coming of the chosen one. As a result of these hopes, Jesus had to somehow communicate to his disciples and others who had such high hopes for him that he was offering something that was completely different from what they expected. Will you pray with me? All-loving God, help us to become the masters of ourselves that we might truly be the servants of others. Take our minds and think through them. Take our lips and speak through them. Take our hands and do your good works. Take our lives and live out your life. Take our hearts and set them on fire with love for you. Anybody watching this have selected hearing or sight? Sure, we all do. Every second, our brain is bombarded with sensory data from our 5 senses. And you're probably sitting down just now, but already your brain has perhaps stopped consciously focusing on the feel of the seat that you are in. You're probably not thinking about the temperature of the room, although you probably did at one point this morning. There are all kinds of sounds that you're not focusing on right now. Perhaps the faint hum of a fan, somebody sitting beside you. Our brains would probably overload if they had to process every piece of data that our body sensed. We think we see everything, but we're actually being selective all the time. Have you noticed that when you start to shop to buy a car and that you get interested in a particular vehicle, all of a sudden you notice them everywhere? Well, they were there before, but you never noticed them. The part of the brain that filters all of this information is called the reticular activating system, and it's continually at work, even though we never think about it. The goal for all of us, if we're followers of Jesus Christ, is to see the same things that he sees. We want to notice what is important to him. Well, how do we do that? Well, let me share another story with you. A famous movie maker had a huge legal wrangle with his longtime mentor and guide. The younger man simply couldn't handle criticism, and in the end ended up rejecting the person who had helped him so much. When it was all over, a close friend summed up the real problem. It was all about an ungenerous father, he explained, and a son looking for affirmation and love. It happens all the time, in families, businesses, the world over. Many children grow up who have never had a father say to them, either in words, in looks, or in hugs, "You are my dear child," let alone, "I am pleased with you." In the Western world, even those fathers who think this in their hearts are often too tongue-tied or embarrassed to tell their children how delighted they are with them. And many, alas, go by the completely opposite route of angry voices and bitter rejection and slamming of doors. And that has a powerful and often very negative impact on a person. The whole Christian gospel could be summed up in this point: that when the living God looks at us, at every baptized and believing Christian, he says to us what he says to Jesus on that day. He sees us not as we are in ourselves, but as we are in Jesus Christ. It sometimes seems impossible, especially to people who have never had this kind of support from their earthly parents, but it's true. God looks at us and says, "You are my dear, dear child, and I am delighted with you." Try reading that sentence that you see on the screen slowly with your own name at the start of it, and reflect quietly on God saying that to you, both at your baptism and every day since. In our baptism, we are seen by God not as we are in all our brokenness and sin, but who we are in Jesus, who by his death and resurrection made us right with God for all eternity. The French writer Henri Barbusse tells of a conversation overheard in a trench full of wounded men during the First World War. One of the men, who knew he only had minutes to live, says to another man, "Listen, Dominic, you've led a very bad life. Everywhere you are wanted by the police. But there are no convictions against me. My name is clear. So here, take my wallet, take my papers, take my identity, take my good name, take my life, and quickly hand me your papers, that I may carry all your crimes with me to death." The good news is that through Jesus, God makes a similar offer. Something wonderful happens to us when we are baptized. When we are baptized, we identify ourselves with Jesus. We publicly declare our intention to strive to be like Jesus and to follow God's will for our lives. When we are baptized, our lives are changed. We see things differently than before. We see others differently than before. Baptism enables and empowers us to do the things that Jesus wants us to do here and now. We are able to identify with Jesus because he was baptized. And we are able to love as he loved. Such identification is life-changing. That kind of identification shapes what we believe, and it claims us. At our baptism, and at every baptism of others, we, as individuals able to answer for ourselves and as a community of faith, make or renew our baptismal vows. As part of those vows, we are invited to renounce the spiritual forces of wickedness and to reject evil and injustice and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves. So if we are to see things differently, to see others differently, then how are we to recognize wickedness, injustice, oppression, and evil? Well, let's take evil, for example. People of the Lie, the hope for human healing evil, is one of Dr. M. Scott's most intriguing works. In his work with patients as a psychiatrist and as a Christian, Dr. Peck Scott had come to see that there were people who were simply evil. He thinks that this evil needs to be studied by scientists as well as by theologians. Early in his book, he tells the stories from his counseling practice that helped him see this reality. He calls it the case of Bobby and his parents. Bobby was a 15-year-old boy who was sent by the court to see him because his grades in school were failing precipitously and he was depressed and he had had an accident with a stolen car. The doctor met with Bobby and heard his story. He noticed that Bobby's face was dull and expressionless, the kind of face one sees in people in a concentration camp. The doctor was alarmed by what he saw. He was even more alarmed by what he heard. He learned that Bobby's older brother, Stuart, had committed suicide in June of the last year. Stuart had shot himself in the head with a .22 caliber rifle. Stuart's suicide had clearly been the cause for Bobby's academic slide and personal depression. But there was more. At Christmas time, Bobby's parents gave him a .22 rifle. Isn't that the same kind of gun that your brother used to kill himself? The doctor said in amazement. Oh no, not the same kind, Bobby replied. It was the same gun. The doctor was stunned. Bobby's parents were all but telling him the whole matter with Stuart was his fault, and that things would be best if he would commit suicide too. And so Dr. Peck called the parents to his office. They seemed to be quite normal, blue-collar, church-going, hard-working folks. And the doctor confronted them with their deed. Don't you see that giving Bobby this gun was like telling him to go out and kill himself? The parents, doctor tells us, couldn't see such a thing. They were blind to the consequences of their own deeds. In his continued work with Bobby and his parents, Dr. Peck began to formulate the thesis that the parents were evil people. He then cites a law of child development that when a child is grossly confronted by the significant evil in its parents, it will most likely misinterpret the situation and believe that that evil resides in the self. Bobby, that is, was in the clutches of evil powers. This evil resided in his parents, whom Dr. Peck discovered to be, as the title of the book says, people of the lie. They were people who simply could not tell the truth about themselves. And that is Dr. Peck's definition of evil. Evil people deceive others by building layer upon layer of self-deception around themselves. Now, evil people are not the same as sinful people. It is not their sins in themselves that they distinguish between evil and sinful people. The difference is that evil people refuse to acknowledge any fault at all in themselves. Their truth is the truth. Their way is the only way, and they will not compromise that truth, and their life choices reflect the need to uphold their truth. In this country today, there are just over 81 million people who voted for Joe Biden, and a little more than 74 million who voted for Donald Trump. That equates to 306 electoral college votes for Joe Biden and 232 votes for Donald Trump, a win for Joe Biden which has been certified by Congress. And of that 74 million people who voted for Trump, it appears that a very small proportion simply cannot accept the fact that those numbers are the attested results and claim that their truth, the election was rigged, stolen from their candidate, is the only truth, and anything to the contrary is fake and to be railed against. The events of January the 6th, 2021, in the Capitol building will go down as one of the darkest days in American history. For those who stormed the Capitol refused to acknowledge any fault in themselves in what they believed, and that it was not based in fact. Their failure to recognize the fault that was in their lives was masked by a frustration that boiled over into despicable acts of violence and vandalism and, sadly, death. What then is a Christian response? How might we see things differently, as if through the eyes of Jesus? For Jesus was not unaware of oppression and violence done to fellow Jews at the hands of those who occupied the country he was in. Jesus abhorred violence. He told Peter to sheath his sword when he drew it and injured a temple guard. He told the crowds wanting to stone a woman to throw the first stone if they were without sin. The way of the Messiah was not to be through insurrection and the violent overthrow of the government of the day. The way of the Messiah was to be humble service and a willingness to go the extra mile, to turn the other cheek and ultimately show his absolute love for everyone through his sacrificial death. Embodying the role of the suffering servant set out by the prophet Isaiah centuries earlier, Jesus brought about change through seeking to love those who would persecute him, forgive those who would torture and kill him. A love so great that not even death itself could hold him. So how do we become like Jesus? We do so first by acknowledging him, wanting him in our lives, and through baptism, being made like him in the eyes of God. We do so by serving the community and demonstrating the love of God for all people. We do it by being ready to point out injustice and seeking to relieve the oppression that people suffer in this world through debt and addiction and abuse and neglect and a whole lot more. We do it by transforming the world through the love of God to enable others to seek out the life that Jesus can offer them. We do it by seeking to love others, especially when they do not see the way we see. Thomas Merton once said, "The beginning of love is to let those we love be perfectly themselves and not to twist them to fit our own image. Otherwise, we love only the reflection of ourselves that we find in them." So, my friends, remember your baptism. Amen.